Imagine this. It's a frigid February morning in 1869. Inside Westminster Abbey, the ancient stone walls reverberate with the sound of pickaxes and the laboured breaths of workers. Torchlight flickers, casting eerie shadows across the Gothic architecture as Dean Arthur Stanley gazes into a newly opened cavity beneath the marble floor. The air is dense, not only with dust from centuries past, but with a pungent, unmistakable scent of decay that's lingered in darkness for over 200 years. Clutched tightly in Stanley's hands are detailed architectural plans and burial records, but they contradict each other. Hidden somewhere in this underground maze is the lost resting place of King James I. Yet, what Stanley is about to uncover extends far beyond one king's tomb. He's on the verge of exposing far darker truths about how royal corpses were treated, revelations that will make your skin crawl and permanently alter your perception of England's royal legacy. Before diving into these stories of buried secrets and royal suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden side of history, consider supporting this journey into the forgotten past, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's remarkable that we can explore these ancient echoes together, across time and space, united by curiosity. But to truly understand this tale, we must go further back. Not to 1869, but to a cold March morning in 1603, within the walls of Richmond Palace. Queen Elizabeth I had collapsed, wordless and unmoving, lying on the floor for 4 days before her attendants managed to guide her into bed. This was the same woman who had once defied the Spanish Armada, dazzled foreign dignitaries with her brilliance, and danced until dawn. Now she was a fragile shadow of her former self, clinging desperately to life, knowing that if she lay down for too long, she might never rise again. Her condition worsened, and she began to stand for hours at a time in her chamber, 15 hours without rest, until she collapsed onto the floor, which her ladies-in-waiting had padded with cushions. Just imagine it. The most powerful woman in Europe, frozen in fear, too terrified to rest, driven by an instinctive dread that sleep meant death. Her attendants understood the signs. They watched in silence, waiting. They knew what was coming. Meanwhile, rumours began to swirl. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her ladies, claimed the Queen was haunted by visions of her deteriorating body. In one especially chilling moment, a playing card with a nail driven through its centre was found on her chair. That single card, pierced through the head, was a cruel omen for a woman who had believed all her life that she ruled by divine right. By now, the image of the radiant Virgin Queen, carefully maintained through years of propaganda, had all but vanished. She had lost most of her teeth, her hair had thinned, and she refused care or even basic hygiene. The courtiers who once fought for her attention now recoiled from the smell of her unwashed body, and the sight of blackened gums where once had been a dazzling smile that captured the hearts of Europe. When Elizabeth finally passed on March 24th, 1603, what followed was deeply unsettling, an event that would spark centuries of morbid speculation. Elizabeth's Lady of the Bedchamber firmly refused to permit a post-mortem examination of the Queen's body. Some have suggested this was done to protect the myth of Elizabeth's virginity. But the question remains, what were they trying to conceal? Was it simply about preserving the legend of the Virgin Queen, or was there something far more unsettling? Could it be that Elizabeth's body revealed secrets too disturbing to be shown to the world? On April 28, 1603, the Queen's funeral procession wound its way through London in a display so powerful that it moved grown men to tears. From Whitehall to Westminster Abbey, the coffin was carried on a hearse, drawn by horses draped in black velvet. A rich purple cloth covered the coffin, topped with a striking effigy of Elizabeth, adorned with a crown and holding a scepter. The wooden figure, painted and dressed in full royal regalia, appeared so lifelike that those who saw it gasped in astonishment. At the Abbey, the effigy of Elizabeth I lay atop her lead-lined coffin, still wearing the garments of power. It was as though the Queen refused to surrender her rule even in death. The streets and rooftops of Westminster were overflowing with people. Crowds filled windows, doorways, gutters, gathered to witness her final journey. And when the crowd saw the statue resting above the coffin, a wave of sighs, groans, and weeping swept through the crowd, unmatched in living memory. Elizabeth's body had been encased in lidi inside a wooden coffin and was initially laid to rest in the vault of her grandfather, King Henry VIII, beneath his grand monument in the abbey. Lead coffins were standard for royalty. They were believed to preserve the body and contain odours. Yet, as we'll soon learn, they held their own dark secrets. 3 years later, in 1606, an event occurred that revealed the cold political maneuvering that surrounded even royal burials. King James I, Elizabeth's successor, ordered that her remains be moved to lie alongside those of her half-sister, Mary. The decision was steeped in symbolism. In life, Elizabeth and Mary had stood on opposite sides of a deep divide. Protestant and Catholic, executioner and persecutor, one who burned heretics, the other who executed a rival queen. They had been bitter enemies. In death, James had Elizabeth's coffin literally placed on top of Mary's. The vault beneath the new white marble monument in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel now held both sisters. The monument, commissioned by James and crafted by sculptor Maximilian Colt and painter Jan de Kritz, featured only Elizabeth's effigy and inscriptions praising her reign. Mary, who had ruled for 5 bloody years, was reduced to a mere afterthought, buried beneath her sister's grandeur. A Latin inscription on the tomb attempted to smooth over the awkward reality. Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of the resurrection. But the truth was far less serene. Elizabeth's massive lead coffin, weighing several hundred pounds, had simply been laid on top of Mary's, creating a grim, double-layered burial that would remain undisturbed for more than 200 years. By the 1860s, however, Westminster Abbey faced a peculiar dilemma. No one could say for certain where King James III had been buried. Over time, the location of his tomb had been lost. The burial records were contradictory, and the Abbey's archives were disorganized and full of inconsistencies. Dean Arthur Stanley, a man with the spirit of an adventurer and the precision of a scholar, received personal permission from Queen Victoria to carry out a full survey of the Abbey's burial vaults. What he was about to uncover would read more like a chapter from a Gothic thriller than a history book. If Indiana Jones had dealt with decayed monarchs instead of ancient artifacts. The excavation began methodically in Henry VIII's chapel. At the base, a stone tablet bore the inscription, "This vault was opened by the Dean, February 11th, 1869. Strikingly, that date marked exactly 3 years since the death of Elizabeth of York in childbirth. Whether this was mere coincidence or a deliberate act of symbolism on Stanley's part remains unclear. When the workers finally broke through the stone ceiling of the vault that held Elizabeth and Mary, the scene that met them could have been pulled from the pages of a macabre novel. The vault was small, confined, and thick with the stale air of centuries. In the dim torchlight, 2 lead coffins lay stacked one atop the other, like a macabre bunk bed. Elizabeth's coffin, larger and more ornate, rested above that of her half-sister Mary. Its contours, more sculpted and human-shaped, echoed the stylized form of the body, similar to the design used for Mary, Queen of Scots. Over the centuries, the LED had oxidized, taking on a greenish patina that gave the coffins an eerie, almost alien appearance. During the 19th century search for the lost tomb of James I, researchers partially opened this very vault, uncovering the stacked coffins, Elizabeth's lying directly above Mary's. But what truly unsettled Dean Arthur Stanley was what he found etched into the surface of Elizabeth's coffin. Carved into the lidi were images and inscriptions. A Tudor rose, Elizabeth's initials, and a date. Stanley meticulously recorded these details. Together they formed a silent narrative, tracing the Queen's path from life through death to this final shadowed resting place. Yet there were other markings, far more disturbing. Someone had scratched graffiti into the leadie, a name, John Ware, along with the year 1645. This was the very year James I was interred in the same vault. Who was John Ware? A labourer? A thief? A curious official? We may never know. But his presence leaves no doubt. The royal vault had been entered. And if one man dared leave his name, what else might have happened down there? It's a haunting thought. In a time when royal relics could fetch high prices, an unguarded tomb filled with monarchs would have been an irresistible prize. The idea that these sacred places were anything but secure casts a long, uneasy shadow. There's another aspect the Victorian chroniclers avoided altogether: the smell. Breaking the seal of a centuries-old vault isn't just about moving stone and lead. It's about releasing the concentrated stench of centuries-old decay, sealed away like some foul spirit in a bottle. According to Elizabeth Southwell, the Queen's corpse had become so bloated with noxious gases that it exploded inside the LED coffin. Although Southwell was later dismissed as an unreliable witness, the idea isn't far-fetched. Lead coffins, despite their intended function of preservation, could act like sealed pressure chambers. As a body decomposes, it emits gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and others. In a wooden coffin, these gases slowly leak out. But in lead, the pressure builds until something ruptures. Accounts from other royal vaults support this grim reality. When Edward IV's tomb at Windsor was opened, his leg bones and feet were found submerged in 3 inches of a dark liquid, a vile mixture thought to be the byproduct of bodily decay and the breakdown of his wooden coffin. Elizabeth's coffin, made entirely of leadie, would have been extraordinarily heavy. Modern royal lead-lined coffins can exceed 500 pounds, requiring 8 pallbearers instead of 6. With thick walls and regal proportions, Elizabeth's casket would have been just as massive. And that enormous weight rested for over 260 years atop Mary's coffin beneath it. For more than 2.5 centuries, Elizabeth's remains quite literally pressed down on her sisters, forming a grotesque and haunting image. One coffin crushing another, their royal bodies decaying together in a disturbing stack no amount of pageantry could dignify. Their story reflects a wider, troubling truth about how the remains of royalty were handled in Britain. Death did not end their role in politics. Monarchs continued to be used, repositioned, and displayed long after their reigns had ended. Even centuries earlier, the same pattern played out. In 1163, King Edward the Confessor's coffin was opened and moved to a new shrine at Westminster Abbey by order of a curious Henry II. Inside, Edward was found with his long white beard still intact, clothed in gold-threaded robes, wearing a mitre on his head and purple shoes on his feet, a medieval display of sanctity, frozen in time. The pilgrim's ring worn by Edward the Confessor was taken by Henry II as a sacred relic, and his cloth of gold burial robes were repurposed into 3 lavish copes. Ceremonial cloaks for church use, this seemingly casual desecration of royal remains was not an anomaly. In fact, it was common practice. Monarchs during the medieval and Renaissance periods routinely relocated, examined, and even looted the tombs of their royal predecessors. During my research, I came across a particularly unsettling episode involving the remains of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester. His tomb at the Abbey Church of St. Albans became a bizarre attraction for women who believed the embalming fluid used in his burial had magical properties that could cure wrinkles. Sex workers capitalized on the myth, selling thimbles of the liquid for profit, and even physicians came to collect samples for supposed medical experimentation. Eventually, the supply of embalming fluid ran dry, but the demand didn't stop. Visitors began taking strands of Humphrey's hair, his fingernails, even bone fragments, until only a few skeletal remains were left. This grotesque trade in royal body parts thrived for centuries. Hair, teeth, bones, and embalming materials, anything once connected to a king or queen, was seen as valuable, whether for collectors, physicians, or believers in supernatural healing. In 1784, the church wardens of St. Mary's in Bury St. Edmunds removed the altar monument of Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and former Queen of France. Although there was no practical reason to disturb her grave, they opened her coffin and discovered that her hair remained remarkably intact, measuring 2 feet long and still a beautiful golden color. Less than a century later, in 821, the tomb of King Richard II was opened during restoration work. His skeleton was nearly complete, but several relics were removed and ended up in a most unlikely place. Years later, fragments of wood from the coffin, a scrap of fabric, and a piece of leather from one of Richard's gloves were found stored in a cigarette box in the basement of London's National Portrait Gallery. The box, dated August 31st, 1871, had held royal remains for decades, forgotten and tucked away like common trinkets. This is what often became of kings and queens once death silenced them. They became objects of curiosity, souvenirs for the living. One of the most infamous examples is that of Queen Catherine of Valois. For centuries, her remains were kept on public display at Westminster Abbey. Visitors could pay Abbey staff for the privilege of seeing her corpse, housed in a wooden coffin that was opened again and again for profit. Above the very vault where Elizabeth and Mary were entombed, stacked one atop the other like luggage, James I commissioned a grand monument. It served as both memorial and propaganda. The monument depicted Elizabeth I in all her majesty, crowned, robed in state, holding a scepter. But a coloured illustration from around 1618 to 1620 reveals the full spectacle. The queen dressed in an ermine-trimmed crimson robe, holding a blue orb, her face painted with lifelike flesh tones. Even the 4 lions that flanked the effigy's corners were gilded in gold. Today, no trace of that original colour survives. The effigy was a carefully crafted illusion, marble and pigment woven into a fantasy. It portrayed Elizabeth not as she was, but as she wished to be remembered. Regal, radiant, timeless. Beneath that monument, however, the truth lay in stark contrast. In the cold darkness of the vault, the woman who once commanded armies and inspired fear in monarchs had been reduced to whatever remained inside a heavy lead coffin, resting atop her sister like an afterthought in a forgotten storeroom. Dean Stanley's published account of the excavation was shaped by Victorian decorum, requiring him to soften the harshest truths. But the silence between the lines speaks volumes. Reading between the lines of Stanley's carefully measured prose, we begin to glimpse what he truly encountered in that tomb. He wrote that the upper coffin, larger and more distinctly shaped to the form of a human body, rested atop the lower. That description is telling. It suggests that Elizabeth's lead casket had retained the outline of her corpse, molded tightly around her body and preserving that shape even after 2.5 centuries. Victorian propriety, however, meant that certain observations would never be included in an official report. If there were any signs of foul odor, corrosion, or unexpected deterioration, Stanley may have recorded them privately, but they would not appear in print. Such truths were too undignified for public consumption. Yet, Elizabeth's story didn't end with that 19th century examination. Even in death, she continued to serve as a political symbol, her image adjusted to meet the needs of the present. In 1975, nearly 400 years after her burial, a gilded collar featuring the Three Brothers pendant was added to her effigy, created by Mrs. H. Hughes. Someone had decided the statue needed more adornment, more pageantry, to uphold the royal ideal. If one could descend into Elizabeth's vault today, the LED coffins would still be there, stacked just as Stanley found them. But lead, though dense, is a soft metal, and time is relentless. After 4 centuries, those coffins would show their age. Corrosion, warping, perhaps even partial collapse. The Tudor rose, initials, and date that Stanley once documented would likely still be visible. silent inscriptions on the soft LED like signatures in a guest book for the dead. And the graffiti etched by John Ware in 1645 would remain too, a crude reminder that even royal graves are not immune to intrusion. Perhaps the most profound truth Elizabeth's story reveals is that death is the great equalizer. No amount of gilded marble, thick lead, or ceremonial reverence can preserve a body forever. Elizabeth, who once ruled empires, commanded fleets, and defied popes, was ultimately reduced to what all humans become: a decomposing form sealed in a box, subject to the slow chemistry of decay. The Virgin Queen, who never submitted to a man in life, was finally conquered, not by armies or suitors, but by time, gravity, and organic breakdown. And in a final bitter twist, her remains were forced into an eternal embrace with the sister she had despised. Stacked one atop the other, the two women, once symbols of division, became fused in death, a grotesque parody of reconciliation. But Elizabeth's coffin is not the only thing that stinks in this story. The real rot lies in the way power treated her remains, as symbols, as relics, as curiosities. The odor is not just that of human decomposition, but the moral stench of a society that refused to let its dead rest. Each time Elizabeth was disturbed, moved, or redressed, it revealed more about the living than the dead. When James I stacked his predecessors for convenience, he exposed his disregard for their humanity. When a nameless vandal in 1645 carved his name into a royal coffin, he showed how easily dignity could be pierced. When Stanley pried open their tomb in the name of scholarship, he mirrored Victorian society's thirst for knowledge, wrapped in the guise of reverence. And now, even we tell her story not to mourn, but to marvel. We reduce her life and death to content, to spectacle. Elizabeth still isn't allowed to rest. We continue to mine her burial for meaning, for drama, for entertainment. In the end, the queen who refused to marry, who outwitted her enemies, and who insisted on ruling alone, met a fate more imprisoning than any marriage ever could. Not a union with Philip of Spain, not execution like her mother, but a narrow lead box, placed in a vault, crushed against the sister she once loathed, silent, immobile, and eternally confined. This was the woman who once declared, "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Yet, even the heart and stomach of a king are no match for time, for entropy, and for the cold calculations of those who outlive you. As you walk through Westminster Abbey today, remember what lies beneath the grandeur. Beneath the polished monuments and glorious effigies is the uneasy truth of what happens when power dies. The marble statue tells one story, of glory, sovereignty, and eternal memory. But the LED box beneath it tells another, a story of corrosion, of disruption, and of the ultimate vulnerability of all who live. The stench of Elizabeth's coffin may be long gone, but the deeper stench, what we do to each other, even in death, still lingers. And perhaps that is the true horror. Not what happened to Elizabeth's body, but what it reveals about us, the living, who could never leave her alone. In the darkness beneath Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth I still waits, her coffin slowly collapsing, her remains gradually settling, her sister's bones still bearing her weight after more than 4 centuries. The Virgin Queen, who never bowed to any man, lies eternally horizontal, finally conquered by the only power that reigns over all, time. And in that eternal silence, if lead could speak or stone could whisper, what might they tell us? Of nights when the abbey echoes with more than just wind. Of moments when the smell of centuries mingles with something older. Something that reminds us that beneath the pageantry, beneath the robes and crowns, we are all just flesh and bone, waiting our turn to be claimed by the dark.